The headlines on RT International. Syria's ceasefire, brokered by Russia and America, comes under increasing strain as Moscow claims Assad's forces are the only ones actually observing the agreement, as Washington acknowledges it may have made the wrong bet.
The opposition is probably never going to be strong enough to topple Assad.
Violent clashes break out between the far right and asylum seekers. These scenes here from the east of Germany. And leaked emails reveal the warmth between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton may not be that sincere, as the presidential candidate slams Obama and refers to him as that man. And just 2 days now until Russians head to the polls to make their choice in the country's parliamentary election. Midday on Friday here in Moscow. Thanks for joining us. It's RT International. The Syrian ceasefire, brokered by Russia and the US, is coming under increasing strain. Moscow notes that Damascus is still the only party actually observing the agreement, while US-backed so-called moderate rebels increased the number of shellings of residential areas. And RT has received footage showing the latest developments on the ground in Aleppo, which has seen some of the fiercest fighting to date.
The situation in the city is still tense. Residential areas and Syrian army positions have been shelled 15 times in the last 24 hours.
Let's bring in some live pictures for you right now. As to make the ceasefire easier to monitor, the Russian Defense Ministry right now is streaming these live pictures of the fragile ceasefire in Aleppo. Right now, we are patched through to an airborne drone for this live stream in the skies above Aleppo. But not just drones in the skies, but also cameras on the ground are feeding us video as well. And ultimately, the Russian Ministry of Defense, they're letting this come out onto international stream so that ultimately anyone can in some way or another help to observe the ongoing ceasefire. Well, we asked former Pentagon official Michael Maloof if at the end of the day there are any sides that could be interested in actually derailing the peace process.
I think what's happening on the ground is that the so-called moderates that the U.S. supports is actually vying for more positions of strength. They're using the lull in the ceasefire to regain battlefield positioning. They really want to take Aleppo, and I think that this is going to continue on. They don't want to have a settlement with President Assad of Syria. They want him out, and we're all working against cross purposes. And the United States is so confused because it backs the Saudis on the one hand, but they want to have a ceasefire on the other, and yet we can't. They're not sharing intelligence on who the so-called moderates really are, and it's just one kabuki. Right now, that's what the Russians are asking for is tell us who these groups are. Let's have full accountability. Let's declassify the agreement. I don't know why it's classified in the first place.
A key stumbling block in the Syria talks has been the failure to split US-backed rebels and jihadists. However, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry now saying, in fact, there are ways to divide the groups. Here's Guyane Chichikan.
The Obama administration's enthusiasm for the Syrian rebels has waned over the years. In 2014, the U.S. officially began to train and arm Syrian rebels.
In the fight against ISIL, we cannot rely on an Assad regime that terrorizes its own people. Instead, we must strengthen the opposition as the best counterweight to extremists like ISIL.
A year later, the administration had to scrap the train and equip program because the Pentagon managed to find only a handful of rebels with, quote-unquote, the right mindset to train.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five.
This train and equip program has not frankly, lived up to what we initially thought.
The U.S. continued to send arms to Syrian rebels, despite widespread reports that many of the weapons were either being sold or handed over to al-Qaeda-affiliated groups.
Nobody's abandoning forever the idea of training. It's just that there's going to be a pause here while a focus is more aptly put on the equipping aspect. It does not remove from the field and from the fight Syrian fighters that are actively engaged against ISIL. You can supply them and equip them and support them.
Reports of U.S.-backed rebels sharing resources with al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, became difficult to ignore.
We recognize that, in places like Aleppo and elsewhere, that there's a mixing or commingling, whatever you want to call it, and that we need to work more closely together to disentangle, where these groups are mixing with known terrorist groups.
But despite Washington saying this for months, no progress has been reported in that regard. Moreover, earlier this week, Ahrar al-Sham, Syria's second largest rebel group, refused to break ties with al-Nusra, which now calls itself Fatah al-Sham. Secretary Kerry suggests there may be new ways to do what the U.S. hadn't been able to do for months.
As they separate, or as we work to know better exactly who's where, there are refined ways that we can have to actually make sure we're taking on Nusra and not taking on the legitimate opposition.
It's not clear what the refined ways are, but Washington may have a new incentive to follow through with the responsibility that it took upon itself.
Assad will never be able to restore legitimacy throughout the country. The opposition is probably never going to be strong enough to topple Assad.
In 2012, President Obama said Assad's days are numbered and seemed to believe rebels were about to take over. In the years to come, we've seen the rise of ISIL and al-Qaeda in Syria. But hope still lingered in the administration that the rebels would topple Assad. That was until it turned into a mess, where it is difficult to tell where the line is between legitimate opposition and terrorists. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chagyan, RT.